So this is the third lecture in our first week of lectures here. What I've tried to do is basically condense all the lectures down into like smaller chunks so you don't have to watch a super long video. I realize there's more of them, but then you're watching a shorter amount. So this lecture is broken into still kind of introducing earth science. We'll talk about the scientific method. We can't have a science course without talking about the scientific method. And then the second part of this mini lecture is what earth scientists do. All right, so as I said, the first part is kind of just the scientific method. Again, you've probably had this at some point in your educational career. You've talked about the scientific method if you've taken a science class, but we can't have a science class without not talking about it. So, doing science, we call the scientific method. If we are thinking about scientific method from an earth science perspective, earth science and the scientific method helps us figure out many, many things. Basically, any kind of age of a rock that has ever been measured is using the scientific method. So, for example, we can determine how fast rivers eroded the Grand Canyon to produce valleys, which took about 5 million years. And the reason that that was determined is that you can measure the age of the rocks, and then you can calculate the rate of erosion and use that to figure out how old the Grand Canyon is. So that's an example of using the scientific method to solve any kind of earth science problem, or one example. So, again, if you haven't had the scientific method or it's been a while since you've had the scientific method, it basically follows a cycle. So first you're going to make some kind of observation about any kind of phenomenon. So you'll observe the sky is blue. Then you're going to ask a question. So you have your observation, the sky is blue. Your question, why is the sky blue? Then you're going to develop a hypothesis. So I'm just making something up here, but the sky is blue because paint. This guy got painted. That's a terrible example, but I'm going to roll with it. So the sky is blue because of this reason would be your hypothesis. Hypothesis can also be an if-then statement. So for example, you might say if the sky is blue, then it was because it was painted or something like that. This is a really terrible example, but I apologize. So then once you have your hypothesis, then you'll have an experiment. You're going to develop and design an experiment to test why the sky is blue. Then you'll do an analysis of the results of that experiment, and then you'll make a conclusion about it. So if you accept your conclusion, then the experiment is done. And then if you don't accept it, you start the loop all over again. You observe, ask another question, you hypothesize, you experiment, you analyze, and you make another conclusion. All right, so I already said you go through observation, you ask your question, you develop a hypothesis, then you're going to test it with an experiment, analyze your results, come to some conclusions. So let me give you a better example than the one that I came up with off the top of my head. So imagine as you're driving home, your car suddenly stops running. So that's your observation. Your car has stopped running. Hopefully it does not stop running in the fashion of this old vehicle here that's playing through. So the question would be, what data or information might you collect about your car? So if you collect information about your car, you're probably going to get out. You're probably going to go check the oil potentially. You'll check the gauges on the dashboard of your car. You'll make sure your tires are inflated. You'll make sure you're not out of gas. So you'll make those kind of observations. So here's what you observed. Your car sputtered to a stop. The starter cranks the engine over, but the car won't stay running. And then your gas gauge is sitting on empty. So obviously it's not a situation like this one here with this person sinking into the water. But then the next question would be, what hypotheses would you form about your car? So your hypothesis is going to be, my car stopped running because the gas gauge is on empty. My car stopped running because my car is out of gas. If my gauge for my gas is on empty, then my car is not working. That would be an example of hypotheses. All right, so you could also be a little bit more dramatic. So you could say that my car stopped running because the car needs a new engine. So obviously that's a more extreme explanation or hypothesis. So the more likely one is, my car stopped running because the car is out of gas. So now what do? You're going to be like this person. You'll push your car to a gas station, and you're going to test your hypothesis. So you're going to put gas in the tank. If you use the less extreme scenario, you're going to put gas in the tank, see if it runs. That's your experiment. If you choose the more extreme scenario that you would have a new engine, my car stopped running because it needs a new engine, then you'd have to take the car to a shop and have a new engine installed, or parts of an engine installed. All right, so obviously you're going to choose the easier one. You're going to push your car to the gas station. You're going to put gas in it. And your experiment is by putting gas in the tank. You have now solved that problem, or try to solve that problem. Okay, so once you've done the experiment of putting gas in your car, you can test your hypothesis. So if the car runs after you put gas in it, you're accepting that hypothesis, that car ran out of gas, which is why it stopped running. You accept that was true. If your car doesn't run after you put gas in the tank, you reject your hypothesis and you start over, or you make more observations and you start that cycle again. So obviously this is a simple example of doing the scientific method. So let's apply this to a situation here. So if you're following along with the quiz, you should be answering this question. So you're going to answer the images. Not answer the images. You're going to examine the images. You're going to form a hypothesis as to what a melanarch is. So on the top here, this tells you that all of these visuals are melanarchs. None of these are melanarchs. So you got to figure out which of these 1 through 6 are melanarchs. So you're going to tell me how many images at the bottom represent a melanarch, and then how did you arrive at your answer through your observations. All right, so just to put all this together, if we're looking at the scientific method, you make observations, you'll develop a hypothesis, you'll make a prediction, you'll run an experiment, and then you either accept or reject your hypothesis. If you reject your hypothesis, you're going to revise it, start over, have a new experiment, have a new prediction, have a new test. But if you accept your hypothesis at the end, you might either run some further tests, or if you do it enough and it's repeatable, then you might arrive at something like a theory. So in science, we differentiate between a hypothesis and a theory. A theory is something that has hundreds of experiments that have arrived at the same conclusion, and they can be repeated to get the same results. If you have enough data and evidence of something being true, then we call it a theory because it's repeatable and other people, other scientists can do the same experiment, arrive at the same results, then we call that a theory. So I want to just put this little caveat here. So if we're talking about what good science is versus bad science, which I'll go through bad science in a second, good science is something that's testable. Good science is also something that is repeatable. So let's talk about bad science. So what does bad science mean? So if we have an example of something that is bad science, it's usually either it doesn't have an experimental design that actually tests for what it was trying to test for. So the experiment that they designed is not actually testing what the scientists think it's testing for. So that'd be an example of bad science. If you use statistics a certain way, you can make numbers say what you want them to say by using certain statistics. So if you use persuasive statistics, that's an example of bad science because you're kind of telling the story that you want to tell as the researcher rather than what the data is actually showing you. That's an example of bad science. If you make up results or fake results, obviously that's an example of bad science. And then if your conclusions are based on feelings and not what the actual data says, then that is probably an indicator of bad science. So there's many examples of bad science in the world. If you want to read through the cartoon that's on the bottom of the slide here, feel free to. But a good example would be like a drug that is advertised as a miracle cure, but then it doesn't actually work for something, for what it's supposed to be able to do. That would be an example of bad science. All right, so on your quiz, for example, you'll have a question where you need to rehash to me or reiterate what the difference between something that's good science and something that is bad science is. All right, so just to finish up, let's talk about the role of earth scientists. You all might already be familiar with what earth scientists do, but just to kind of, again, introduce the course and what earth scientists actually do. We measure and we understand natural processes. So myself, I study soil, I study rock, I study water, I study chemistry, and I study the interactions of all of those. So I measure these natural processes of like how do rocks break down and then release arsenic, a known poison, to the environment naturally. So we measure and understand natural processes. So how do we do that? We use a variety of tools. So myself, I personally go into the field at least once a week. I'm either out in a river or a stream or in a field, basically collecting soil, rock, and water samples. So we collect samples at field sites. We got a volcanologist here getting a sample of lava, a standard hydrologist getting a water sample, and then this is a weather station on the right side. So we got to go in the field, collect data, bring that data back to the lab, and then we can either create geologic maps or maps of what we're trying to display, or run models like this wave ocean model here on the right side. All right, and then the last couple of slides here is just how earth scientists help society. So there's a couple of ways that earth scientists are valuable in society, which I realize it probably sounds like I'm just tooting my own horn here in terms of what earth scientists do, but just to show you ideas of what earth scientists actually do. So help protecting and predicting against natural hazards, or helping protect against and predicting natural hazards. This is a hazard map of the US here. If you look basically in different regions of the US, it's kind of keyed by the type of hazard you'd have to worry about. So if you're in New York, basically you got to worry about hurricanes and floods. Let's say you're over in LA, in Los Angeles, you have to worry about landslides and earthquakes. If you live in Seattle, then you have to worry about landslides, volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods. If you're in the center of the US, in Oklahoma City, you got floods and you have tornadoes. So geologists help predict those natural hazards, but also they help in terms of like engineering and trying to protect against those natural hazards. In addition to protecting against natural hazards, we find and sustain Earth's resources. So that would be things like fossil fuels. Geologists know where to find oil. Geologists know where to find natural gas. Geologists know where to find coal. So they help and assist with mining fossil fuels. They also help with finding minerals, so gold, silver, copper, lithium. They know how to find those resources. So in addition to finding them, a big part is also sustaining them. So how do we plant trees to help capture carbon from the atmosphere and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and put it back into the ground after deforestation? So it's not just finding resources, it's also sustaining those resources. And then lastly, we have protecting the environment. So that's a big portion of what earth scientists do, either through conservation or through political action, trying to protect the environment. And then lastly, ensuring that future generations will survive. So that would be sustainability, trying to ensure that people in the future have the same exact quality of life, if not better quality of life, than we do in today's society. Okay. Then, so to finish up your quiz, what I want you to do is brainstorm and write about your own example of something earth science related that you would be interested in and that you would use the scientific method to determine. So I want you to be kind of detailed here. So what is your observation about something earth science related? What question would you ask about that observation? What's your hypothesis? What experiment would you run? How would you analyze the data that you collect? And then lastly, how would you ensure that it's good science using what I described as being good science a couple slides ago? So this answer will probably be 5 to 6 sentences if you're doing a good job on this question.